to our second Saturday webinar of the year, which is part of a series of Saturday webinars this year made possible by the Ashbrook Center. The Ashbrook Center is an independent center at Ashland University and offers a number of resources to help teachers teach young citizens what it means to be an American. I am Chris Burkett, Associate Professor of Political Science and History at Ashland University. I am also co-chair, along with my colleague John Moser, of the Master of Arts in American History and Government program here. I teach undergraduate and graduate courses on American political thought, including the American founding and the Progressive Era. Before I introduce our panelists for today's webinar, let me say something about the theme and then the format of our Saturday webinars for those who are joining us for the first time. This year's theme for our Saturday webinar is inspired by a new feature that the Ashbrook Center has added to our teachingamericanhistory.org website, which is a list of 50 core American documents. We wanted to put together a list of documents that we thought every citizen, especially high school students, should read and know something about. The list we came up with is not exhaustive by any means, nor is it necessarily authoritative. It's a starting point. The list of documents is meant to be a starting point to help teach individuals something about what America means and what it means to be an American. And we started the list with the Declaration of Independence, even though we know we could have started with earlier documents going back to the Mayflower Compact and others. But we chose to start with the Declaration because it's the one document that best encapsulates, we believe, many of the ideas that shaped America and Americans well before 1776, and has continued. These ideas have continued to be, along with the Constitution, at the heart of political debate in this country all the way up to today. And we at the Ashbrook Center believe that America has a story, and we believe that story is one of liberty. And by that I mean the story involves Americans who set for themselves very high goals when they announced in 1776 certain self-evident truths regarding human equality, natural liberty, and the purpose of government. The American story is in one sense one of a people pursuing the fulfillment of those ideas and struggling, sometimes by blood and sword, to live up to those ideas. Our hope is that the documents we've chosen for that list will perpetuate conversation and foster new discussion on these important ideas. I'm also very happy to announce that soon the documents listed on the website will be available in book form, published by the Ashbrook Center. And we will continue to add more and more resources to the 50 core American documents website, which again is accessible through the teachingamericanhistory.org website. The website, the book, and these webinars are meant to foster that kind of discussion. And so our Saturday webinars, again, as I said, are built on 54 documents for this year. The idea behind these webinars is to have some thoughtful scholars on various subjects engage in some serious but collegial conversation on American principles. And we invite all of you to share in that conversation as our panelists reveal to us something about how their own work on these questions. So for our participants joining us, please feel free to type any questions or observations that you have into the chat box feature of the software, and we'll try to have our panelists address them at some point during our conversation. Let me also mention that at the end of the webinar today, you'll be asked to fill out a survey form. So please complete that form and include your address so that we can send you a letter documenting your participation in today's webinar. With that, I'm happy to introduce our panelists today. David Foster is Associate Professor of Political Science and Chair of the Department of History and Political Science at Ashland University. He teaches undergraduate courses in political philosophy, and in our Master of Arts of American History and Government program, he teaches courses on Tocqueville, Mark Twain, and the Federalist Papers. He has a Bachelor of Arts degree from McMaster University, and a Master of Arts and a PhD in Political Science from the University of Toronto. He has published numerous articles, including Mark Twain on the American Character, Gambling on Virtue, Israel's Quest for Security, Civic Education, It's a Buyer's Market, Disposable Professors, Great Inflation, and Other Problems, on the goal of liberal education, the Bible and natural freedom in John Locke's political thought, and Taming the Father, John Locke's critiques of patriarchal fatherhood. So you can see the kind of wide-ranging interest that Professor Foster has. And his mind is such that despite the breadth of his interests, there's great depth in everything that he writes. It's very impressive. I'm honored to be his colleague here at Ashland University. Stephen F. Knott is Professor of National Security Affairs at the United States Naval War College. He served as co-chair of the University of Virginia's Presidential Oral History Program and directed the Ronald Reagan Oral History Project. Professor Knott received his PhD in political science from Boston College and is taught at the United States Air Force Academy and the University of Virginia. He is the author of a book on Alexander Hamilton's controversial image in the American mind, Alexander Hamilton and the Persistence of Myth. He's also published Secret and Sanctioned Covert Operations in the American Presidency, an examination of the use of covert operations by early American presidents. He is a co-author of The Reagan Years and At Reagan's Side, Insider's Recollections from Sacramento to the White House. In his most recent book, Rushed to Judgment, George W. Bush, The War on Terror, and His Critics, was published in 2012. We're also honored to have him teach in our Master of Arts in American History and Government program here at Ashland University, in which I believe, Steve, you taught a course on religion and the American regime, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right, Chris.
Many other things. So thanks to both of you for being here today. Let me, if you will, allow me to introduce the theme for today's topic, the theme for today's webinar, by first of all reminding us of the title that we would assign to this webinar. The title is Religious Liberty and the American Character. Religious Liberty and the American Character. And to introduce us to this conversation, we asked participants to read the following documents, all of which are included on the list of 54 American documents. James Madison's Memorial and Remonstrance Against Religious Assessments, Thomas Jefferson's Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, James Madison's Speech on Amendments to the Constitution, George Washington's Letters to the Hebrew Congregation at Newport, the Adoption of the Bill of Rights, and James Madison's Essay on Property. Now, the title of the webinar itself presents us, I think, with an immediate question, because there's an "and" in the title. Religious liberty and the American character. The "and," I think, could suggest that these are two different topics, or perhaps, though distinct, they are related, or perhaps even that they're inseparable. So perhaps our panelists might like to weigh in at the beginning on maybe the relationship of these two themes or topics. Are they related? If so, in what way are they related? Or are they not related? I'll also make a few other general observations to serve as possible starting points for the discussion. But again, you're free to start in any way you want. But I just want to make a few broad observations about what I perceive to be some contemporary views of these themes by some recent and contemporary scholars. For example, I'm familiar with some scholars, I'm sure you're all familiar with some scholars who have made the argument that there really is no such thing as a uniquely American character, especially at the time of the founding. That is, the idea that there is such a thing as an American character is a sort of invention of later generations of Americans. Some scholars argue that to the extent that there was such a thing as an American character, it really wasn't that much different from the British character, or the character of British subjects, or the British mind. So I would suggest that maybe we at some point talk about, we don't have to again, but we might want to talk about whether or not these views are correct, or is there in fact, as Thomas Jefferson suggested in his letter to Henry Lee, something like an American mind that is unique from all other kinds of minds. Another argument I've heard regarding these things is that the founders' understanding of religious liberty has had a negative impact on American society, and in fact has led over the centuries to a decline of religion in the United States. I wonder if we might talk about the extent to which that may or may not be correct. Another argument I've heard from some scholars is that the American understanding of liberty was almost entirely focused on individual rights. And as a result of that focus, the concept of civic duty, of civic virtue, was all but neglected by the founders, which has in turn led to a society in which individuals relentlessly pursue their own individual rights and happiness, and in so doing have contributed to a kind of decline, if you will, of civic virtue, perhaps even patriotism in the country. And one other observation just to throw out here, start with, is that, again, I've heard and read others make the argument that the American character, again, to the extent that there is such a thing, is marked by a kind of overzealous fondness, or even relentlessness, I should say, in the pursuit of property. And I know you're familiar with certain European thinkers who come a little bit later in the 18th, 19th, and even into the 20th centuries, who have a kind of contempt for what they view as this American focus on the pursuit of happiness through the acquisition of property. And I wonder if you might want to comment on that, on those views, or perhaps at some point talk about maybe what was really the founders' understanding of the relationship of property, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So, just some broad observations. To start with, you're happy to talk about anything you want to introduce your thoughts on these things. Perhaps talk about the nature of American liberty. What does it kind of mean? What do you think when you think of the term American character? But any way you want to do this, take this in any direction you like. So, Dr. Foster, why don't we start with you, David?
Okay.
These things, please.
Thank you, Chris. Boy, such a lot of different topics. I'm not exactly sure where to begin with that. Let me just reflect kind of generally, just to start with, on the relationship between the two topics that you mentioned. Something that struck me as I was rereading these documents. At first I was trying to figure out how to put them together, but then I kind of noticed a theme, especially in the documents that concern religious liberty, that there seemed to be a sense that among Madison and Jefferson especially, that the question of religious liberty was sort of the canary in the mine for American rights. This was the leading issue and the most important right, and that in a certain sense, the arguments related to religious liberty applied also to all the other rights. And in a way, it was the most important right, that if you gave that one up or let it slip away through even very small things like a very tiny religious assessment, like in Virginia, that we'll be on a slippery slope to losing all of our rights. So that made me kind of focus on that issue of religious liberty, and I just kind of would raise a couple of questions really to add to the ones that you raised, Chris. One is, why is religious liberty such an important right or such an important issue? Especially if you think about, like, in the documents that we're reading, both Madison and Jefferson suggest that our religious opinions have nothing at all to do with the health, with the protection of our civil rights or with our government. Jefferson says our civil rights have no dependence on our religious opinions. And Madison says things that sound very similar to that. So, if that's true, if our religious opinions, if government is not supposed to take cognizance of our religious opinions at all, and our civil rights and our government doesn't depend at all on our religious opinions, why is religion such a big issue? What's the significance of that issue? What's so important about it? And so, I kind of, that's a question I'd like to pursue a little bit. Was it a historical accident that religion was so significant? It just so happened that there were religious fanatics in America, and we had to sort of calm them down. Is that what it was, or was there something? And so that and now that we're kind of a little bit beyond that, we can get over it, or is there something? There's some deeper issue there that we talked about that's kind of still with us today about religion. So that's really my first question, and related to that, and maybe as a way of helping to answer that, I think I'd want to ask the question. When I'm reading Madison and Jefferson and Washington, and also looking at the Bill of Rights and the parts of it that have to do with religion, this question arises in my mind: what did these gentlemen actually mean by religion? What is a religious opinion? And how do we distinguish that from, let's say, moral opinions or political opinions? And I think some of that, if we could answer that question, we might be able to answer some of your questions, Chris, like, you know, the question about the decline of religion in America. We need to know what is a religious opinion, what counts as a religious opinion, before we can answer that.
If I could jump in, I don't necessarily have a good answer to David's question about what is a religious opinion, but I do think he went right to the heart of the matter with that quote from Jefferson from the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. This idea that our civil rights have no dependence on our religious opinions any more than our opinions in physics or geometry. So I found really a remarkable statement, and if you think about it, it's kind of a statement that some secular activist groups today, like People for the American Way, would very much endorse. I would, Chris's question about religious liberty and the American character, it seems to me that both in the founding period and in our time, there are almost two American characters that have never quite been assimilated, in a sense. And if you think about the anti-federalist opposition to the Constitution, some of that, not all of it, but some of that opposition was based on the fact that the Constitution seemed incredibly neutral, I suppose arguably even hostile to religion. There's really no mention of religion in the body of the text at all, except I think a passing reference at the end where they mention the year of our Lord 17 whatever. That's about it. And a number of the anti-federalists were concerned that this new government, in its at best neutral position towards religion, would ultimately undermine the very foundations that were going to make all of this possible. So I think you did sort of have two camps, and those camps, one would be characterized by a kind of fierce devotion to individual rights, the notion of questioning authority, putting one's individual conscience at the forefront of rights that needed to be protected. And then in the other camp, characterized at the time, I think mostly by anti-federalists, this idea that civic virtue and some sort of community-mindedness would be undermined by a government that didn't, at the very least, provide some encouragement for organized religion. And I might add that this opinion wasn't just confined to the anti-federalists. You actually sort of see this in George Washington's farewell address, where he puts a tremendous amount of emphasis on the idea that for the American experiment to succeed, it's going to be very important in a sense that the American people remain a religious people, and that everything in a sense should be done to sort of make sure that happens. So Washington's kind of an interesting character in all of this. I'm not sure I wouldn't even qualify it. I don't think Washington would have embraced the sort of Jeffersonian, Madisonian idea that religious opinions are not particularly all that important. They're no more important than our opinions on physics or the weather or whatever.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'll jump in. you know, all of your points are so good. You're raising again another difficulty with Jefferson, which is to what extent the Jeffersonian, and again, I don't know that Madison and Jefferson agree on everything in this sense, but I kind of tend to put them together, the Madisonian and Jeffersonian understanding of religious liberty. What effect does that really have on the character of the American regime? That is, both of them claim, both in the Memorial and Remonstrance and in the Statute for Religious Freedom, that government support of religion is unnecessary. It's not necessary for the support of religion, and the support of religion, in a way, is not necessary for the support of government. But again, this is a big question. Is that true? And as you point out, Washington disagreed with that, and there are plenty of other figures at the time who disagreed with that view. And it may have depended on the state you were in as well, which would remind people that these religious views are not necessarily national religious views at this time. They vary widely from state to state. But there is this question: to what extent does this understanding of religious liberty and the extent to which that means government should keep its hands out of religious questions altogether, what effect potentially does that have on the character of the American regime in the future and the character of American citizens in the future? You know, the other problematic, I suppose, aspect in the sense that it's not clear is David pointed out, Jefferson makes the statement that our religious opinions should in no way affect our civil rights, right? Our status as equal citizens should in no way be affected by our religious opinions. But I wonder if Jefferson really believed that to be true, or if that's one of these little clips we can, like a sound bite we take from the speech, and we just sort of say, maybe he doesn't necessarily. Maybe he might qualify that another way. I just thought a suggestion, a possibility. Jefferson believed in natural rights. And Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence, I think, put forth the idea that natural rights presuppose some kind of creator, or God, albeit that's a God pretty much reduced to the role of creating nature that exists. But Jefferson, I think, pretty consistently suggested that the idea of natural rights presupposes the idea of some kind of creator.
Yeah.
So, I mean, can you be a good American citizen? Right? You recall some of his other writings, for example, his letter to Henry Lee, where he says all American Whigs believe certain things. One of the things we're led to believe American Whigs believed in was the idea of natural rights. Does that mean that all American Whigs, or drop the Whigs, all Americans properly understood, must at least believe in some kind of creator? Can you be an American without believing in natural rights in Jefferson's mind, and therefore can you also be an American without believing in, at least in some kind of first cause of nature being the way? I mean, these raise big questions about Jefferson's own understanding of it.
Yeah.
I believe Jefferson would have said yes. You can be an American. You can be an American without believing in some type of creator. Because I would think, Chris, my recollection of the drafting of the Declaration of Independence is that Jefferson was essentially forced to put those references into nature's God and so forth. That was not in his original draft, and I don't think he was particularly pleased when he was sort of forced by other members of the drafting committee to put this language in. So I believe that Jefferson would have felt you do have to believe in this notion of natural rights, but you can come to that through using your faculties of reason as opposed to revelation. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, that's good. I'd forgotten that, actually.
Yeah, and to that, let me just add something from the Madison's Memorial and Remonstrance Against Religious Assessment. If you look at point number 4, where he argues that the proposed bill of Patrick Henry for a religious assessment, which Madison is arguing against, he says that that bill violates the equality which ought to be the basis of every law. He says that I don't want to read the whole thing there, but there's a sentence that begins, above all.
Mhm.
Do you see that? Above all, are they to be considered as retaining an equal title to the free exercise of religion according to the dictates of conscience, whilst we assert for ourselves a freedom to embrace, to profess, and to observe the religion, which we believe to be of divine origin, we cannot deny an equal freedom to those whose minds have not yet yielded to the evidence which has convinced us. And I think that means that, if you take that in its fullest sense, that means not just that if you're a Presbyterian, you have to tolerate a Catholic, or vice versa. But I think that in the fullest sense, that means that the American form of government would also be, you cannot deny an equal freedom, to use Madison's language, to those who haven't seen the truth of there being a creator. In other words, to non-believers.
Mhm.
I think that would be the biggest, the widest interpretation of that passage. So I think I incline to agree with Steve about that. That if you appeal to natural rights, that's an appeal that is supposed to be available to reason, and that any rational human being should be able to arrive at the truth of natural rights without a particular theological basis. Now, for me, that's kind of a problem, because even in Madison's sort of wonderful document here, he's frequently talking about our Creator, the Governor of the universe, the universal sovereign, things like that, which are very, which sound monotheistic, and seem to come out of almost a biblical tradition, you could say, or at least a monotheistic tradition. And he opens that piece by arguing that there's this fundamental distinction that we have to make about when we think about human beings, that in one sense, human beings are, in a way, the subjects of a creator, and we owe certain duties to our creator. But then that has to be kept very separate from civil society and the duties we owe to civil society. So we are somehow, I think, almost natural beings, and then also political beings. And he wants to say that those things should be kept very, very, very separate. And the issue of religious freedom is the border between those two things, between the duties that we owe to our Creator, which he says that in this same document, Memorial and Remonstrance, those duties have to, each of us, using our own reason and conviction or conscience, we have to arrive at what those duties are. And government should not in any way direct or support or hinder us hinder us because of our opinions about those duties.
So David, can I interrupt? Can I go back? This is fascinating. Can I go back to one thing you mentioned earlier about that paragraph number 4?
Number 4. Yeah.
Would you? I mean, and Steve, please weigh in on this as well, if you like. Based on what you were suggesting about how that liberty has to be broad enough to include those who have not yet arrived at an understanding of God or belief in a Creator, do you think Madison believes in two different kinds of rights having to do with this question? That is, he sometimes talks about the right to free exercise of religion, but he also talks about the rights of conscience.
Right.
I get asked this a lot. This is a tough one to nail down. Do you think that by rights of conscience, that includes the right to not believe in a Creator in a certain sense, and but that for those who have arrived at the conclusion that there is a God or a Creator, they are then entitled to the rights to the free exercise of that belief through their religion, or is that oversimplifying it? This is a tough thing that I've always struggled with, and people have asked me often, what's the difference between religious liberty and freedom of conscience?
Conscience, right.
I don't know that we can answer that based on what we have in front of us. That's a big question. But it seems as though Madison does make that distinction.
So, Chris, say a little more about that distinction, how you understand that.
Well, I mean, just looking at this paragraph, I had not read it in the way that you were suggesting before, and just on first glance, notice in that sentence that you quoted, David, he says, above all, they are to be considered as retaining an equal title to the free exercise of religion according to the dictates of conscience.
Right.
I know in other places Madison has written about the rights of conscience. I believe, actually, is it in the, I should have highlighted this, but in his speech on proposal to, for amendments, yeah, in Madison's proposal, the speech on amendments to the Constitution, interestingly enough, James Madison wanted to introduce an amendment that would have prohibited not just Congress, but the state government from infringing on these rights. And his fourth proposal for an amendment is that in Article 1, Section 9, which is all, restrictions on what the states may do, he says, shall be inserted these clauses, to wit, the civil rights of none shall be abridged on account of religious belief or worship, nor shall any national religion be established, nor shall the full and equal rights of conscience be in any manner or in any pretext infringed. And there he seems to separate out what he calls religious belief or worship from what he calls the full and equal rights of conscience.
Right. Right.
So I've often wondered if Madison's, let's call it sort of broad understanding of religious liberty includes two kinds of liberties, one of which applies to believers and the other applies to non-believers.
Right.
I don't know how else to describe that. The rights of conscience belong to all of us, by which we are to decide for ourselves, as he says at the beginning of the Memorial and Reminder, what our duty is toward the Creator. And that, I think, includes whether or not we believe in the Creator. Once one believes, one is free to exercise those beliefs, right, in professing our religious opinions and in practicing a mode of worship, without government coming in and saying, no, you can't do that, or you can't vote because of this,
right,
for that practice. I just wonder if Madison has a broader understanding of religious liberty in that sense than some others. Certainly George Washington, I believe.
If I could jump in, I think, and I'm engaging in some conjecture here, but I think for Madison and Jefferson, it was the freedom of conscience was the primary property, if you will, that needed to be protected under this new government. I've often had the sense that their concern regarding freedom of religion, you'll notice in the remonstrance, I think it's point number 7, or paragraph 7, where he makes the argument that ecclesiastical establishments are negatively impacted when there's a mixing of church and state, when there's a mixing of governmental authority with religion. He talks about almost 15 centuries where the legal establishment of Christianity has been on trial, and what have been the fruits of this experiment? More or less in all places, pride and indolence in the clergy, ignorance and servility in the laity, and in both superstition, bigotry, and persecution. Maybe this is my modern cynicism coming through, but I've never quite been convinced that that was really their concern. I don't think that Jefferson and Madison were particularly concerned about the health of these particular Christian sects, and that this was sort of put in there in a sense to make this more palatable to people of belief. So again, I think there was a conscious effort on Madison and Jefferson's part to, in a sense, separate conscience, freedom of conscience from freedom of religion, and for them, the former, conscience was far more important and far more vital.
But Steve, I mean, do they have a valid argument in that in 7 in Madison's memorial, and Jefferson raised at the same point in the religious statute, religious freedom statute, that the history of England, especially Europe, but the history of England reveals that when there is this intermixture or connection between what Jefferson later calls church and state, the result is in fact persecution That's
Sure.
I mean,
I'm not, if they're reading history correctly, I guess I'm just trying to say I've never been quite convinced that they were particularly concerned about that in terms of the negative impact it was having on established religion. I don't think that was a priority for them necessarily.
So the argument that you need to separate these two things for the sake of stuff.
Correct. Again, or maybe this is my Hamiltonian bias coming through. I just find it difficult to believe that Madison and Jefferson were especially concerned about the negative impact on these established churches.
Maybe especially when Jefferson concludes by saying the truth if left to herself will prevail, right?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
Yeah, you know, Steve, I agree with that. I think it probably wasn't the health of established religions was not their foremost concern. But this point also points to something else that's really interesting, that to have an established religion, as the 15 centuries of human experience has shown, does bad things to the character of human beings. Right? It makes us it makes the laity ignorant and servile.
Good point.
And
sure.
And they didn't want that, right? We needed a non-servile people in America who were kind of feistier about our rights.
Sure.
And who have a certain kind of knowledge, and who care a lot about knowledge, you know, as and the pursuit of knowledge, and value our opinions as something very important. We need that type of person, not someone who's looking to other people to give them their opinions, but who are pursuing their own opinions. So I think you're absolutely right, but I think there was that issue that they make the argument that establishment of any kind is bad for religion. But I agree with you that they're, well, it's hard to say. Do they want a kind of pure religion, or do they want to correct religion so that the human beings who are affected by it will actually be better people, have better character?
That's a great question. This is not exactly what you're getting at here, but it reminds me also that I believe Madison and Jefferson were very much in the vein of Benjamin Franklin when it comes to sort of organized religions. I don't know that Madison and Jefferson were necessarily hostile to religion itself, but they were certainly leery of, what they called, what a lot of people back then, including John Locke, which I'm sure you're aware of, called enthusiasm, right?
Enthusiasm.
Who were caught up in enthusiasm of religious fervor that led them to do really unjust things in the name of religion. And I think they were not only leery of that kind of use of religion, that bad use of religion, but they were also not fans at all of organized religion. I'm not sure about Madison's views on this as much as I am Jefferson and Franklin's, but I know that maybe it's possible to say that they're not opposed to religion in general, so long as it aims at good things. But they all certainly seem to have no use whatsoever for orthodox religion, organized religion, because those things tend to be simply opinions handed down to people that are accepted without any kind of thought on their own about whether it's right or not. And the other thing that I bring up I teach this in my classes is that at least from the Jeffersonian Madisonian standpoint, there is a question that if there's no fixed sort of orthodox views with regard to what religion tells us is morally right or wrong, what then becomes the standard for morality in society? And we have a really good question from one of our participants, which I think is getting at that question. The question is, what force can the rule of law have in a society with a diversity of moral views, or a society where religion is based merely on this kind of assent? I mean, what force can the rule of law really have, where we kind of come to the conclusion that moral views, including religious views, are left up to the sort of individual consent or assent of people? And can you have a society organized with that, organized on that kind of understanding of individual religious moral beliefs or individual moral beliefs.
Yeah. Go ahead, Steve.
Well, it's just a relatively small point, but I do think some of the anti-federalists, as I mentioned before, and interestingly enough, some prominent federalists such as Washington and Hamilton did have some concerns about that problem. In other words, if you don't provide some sort of foundation or framework that has the kind of disciplining, in other words, self-government cannot work if you have a people who are incapable of governing themselves. That's a very simplistic sort of slogan, but I do think over time, you see this in Washington's farewell address, that without some sort of organized religion, or at least support for it, I think he was starting to question, and even Hamilton, the fact that Hamilton in 1802 would advocate the creation of a Christian constitutional society, as he called it, that would serve as something of a support for the federal government. It shows in a sense that both Washington and Hamilton were kind of moving arguably in the direction towards what the anti-federalists were saying at the time of the ratification, that it wasn't enough to just have a system based on individual rights.
Right, right. That was certainly, to read to read these different pieces, I went back to read the proposal by Patrick Henry, a bill establishing a provision for teachers of the Christian religion in Virginia, the one that James Madison is arguing against, and the one that Jefferson's proposal was a replacement for. And he says that, he begins by saying that a general diffusion of Christian knowledge hath a natural tendency to correct the morals of men, restrain their vices, and preserve the peace of society. So yeah, so a certain sense of piety is that they thought, and I think this was the traditional thing, the traditional argument, that some kind of religious opinions are really necessary for morality, and ultimately that has an impact on the peace of society. Now, I think the one interesting response, and I think that's, in a way, Madison and Jefferson, and perhaps the founders in general, at least maybe in the initial moments, really were proposing something new when you look at the history of human attempts to establish government. And they seem really to think that the attempts had failed. Madison, let me just take a second to look for, I kind of lost my thought where I was going with this, but I think they think that an establishment, a form of government or a form of society where you respect religions but do not support them, you neither support them officially in public, nor do you disadvantage them officially in public, but you let them be. I think they feel that you will get the benefit from religion, but avoid the problems that history has shown to come from establishment. Yeah. It seems to me that this is a new thing, like a totally radically new thing. And maybe you're right, Steve, if you're suggesting that once they began to see how it was playing out, they started, at least some, perhaps Washington, started to retreat a little bit from the most extreme views. I'm not sure about that. That's a very interesting idea.
Because you have to throw, part of what's lying in the background of Washington's farewell address, to some extent, is the whole experience with the French Revolution and the jihad, in a sense, that was conducted against religious establishments under the revolutionary regime in France. And I think there were some fears in Federalist quarters that we were sort of heading that way. In fact, Jefferson's election in 1800, there were a number of Federalists, particularly in New England, who were convinced that, Bibles were going to be confiscated and churches were going to be leveled.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, we can laugh about that.
Yeah, yeah.
Go ahead, Chris.
Oh, please, David. Please. Go ahead, David.
Well, I think there are a couple of things. One of them is that in Madison's memorial, he makes the argument that when you do not have establishment of religion, the religious sects get along much better with one another. He talks about that moderation and harmony that he appreciates. And so I think his counter argument to the anti-federalists and the traditional argument is that they try to bolster political and civil peace by having one opinion that we all agree on. And they say but history has shown that that doesn't work. When you do that, it becomes a political thing what your opinions are, what your religious opinions are, and you start trying to tax people and get a political power advantage based on that. So if we can take that power advantage and financial implications and punishments and so forth out of the mix, we might actually get a situation where the sects get along better with one another because they're thinking only in terms of persuading one another, not in terms of getting some immediate political advantage. And it seems to me they at least in this early moment here, they thought that whenever you can gain something by having political power, you will do that, and that will corrupt your religious opinions, right?
Yes.
And I think like in Washington's letter to the Hebrew congregation, you see a wonderful expression of just how he expects the different sects and even different religions in a way to harmoniously get along with one another.
Right.
Everyone shall sit safely under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. I mean, think about that. That's wonderful. That you don't have to be afraid on account of your religious opinions.
Right. But at the same time, David, earlier in that letter, in this paragraph, he says, right after he said, we don't have toleration in this country.
Right.
We're not continuing the old world practice of toleration. As the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoy the exercise of their inherent natural rights. He says, happily, the government of the United States, which gives bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, require only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens and giving it on all occasions their effectual support. And that line, in that one paragraph, Washington combines, we have religious liberty in this country, not toleration. It is a natural right.
Right.
But there are duties that come along with that right, and the duty here is that you demean yourself as a good citizen.
As a good citizen,
and, there are a wonderful series of letters. Many religious societies and organizations wrote to Washington when he was elected, congratulating him. Washington wrote back to them personalized letters. For example, he wrote to a Baptist society, he wrote to a Protestant society. I forget where they were at. A lot of them are on our teachingamericanhistory.org website.
Catholic Church.
He even wrote to the Catholics, yeah. And in every one of these letters, he puts the same, and he writes it differently, but he uses the same formulation. In this country, everyone has the right to religious liberty, but that does not excuse you in a certain way, right? From acting the part of a good citizen. And by good citizenship, I guess I mean, or Washington meant, not just supporting your government when it was needed, but respecting the rights of others, respecting the liberties of others, and religious liberty. And that may have included, the rights of conscience or not. But there's that formulation over and over again. And by the way, there's my favorite of those letters is his letter to the Quakers, where Washington says, the Quaker those of the Quaker persuasion in this country are among the most laudable of citizens by their personal examples. But there's a problem with the Quakers in wanting to be exempted from military service or paying taxes to support the military and these sorts of things. And in that letter, Washington writes, the religious scruples of individuals ought to be handled with great delicacy. I hope that Congress can exempt them from military service. It's my personal wish. But if Congress requires them to serve or support the military, even those religious scruples cannot exempt citizens from doing the things that their society deems necessary for the preservation of the hood. But there's a wonderful combination of liberty or rights, if you will, rights and duties in the way Washington describes this in this letter and several others.
Yeah. See, and Chris, that's good, and that points to one of my questions when it comes to this. Who decides what is a religious opinion or a religious duty, and who doesn't? You know, and I think you're suggesting that when Washington says, as long as you demean yourselves as good citizens and give the government its effectual support, right? But it's who's making that decision? Because it seems like the implicit answer is that the political system is making that decision, or the political leaders. So that if the Mormons say our religion says we can't participate, we can't support or participate in military things.
Yeah, I think Americans really. I don't mean to interrupt, sorry, David.
No, go ahead.
This is a big question that Americans really struggle with, and one attempt to resolve that problem that you're raising, David, I think revealed itself. There's a collection of political sermons from the founding era, or a couple of collections of political writings, all of which I think are available on the Liberty online Library of Liberty website. But you read some of these sermons, for example, that were given back then, and one thing that struck me about them is that almost all of them try to, I think, answer this question by comparing the commands of morality revealed through Scripture with the sort of commands of morality demanded by what they understood to be the law of nature, right, or nature somehow. And I think one attempt to reconcile this, or answer this question, is that many Americans thought that the laws of nature provided a kind of a framework for thinking about moral questions that could be used to maybe even filter out, that's not the right word, but sort of use the idea of the laws of nature as a filter to distinguish between acceptable religious opinions and unacceptable religious opinions when it came to what can be done in society in the name of religion. I think many Americans, and again, this sort of revealed itself to me from these political sermons, believe that, look, if you claim to have the right, according to religious liberty, to do something, but it ends up being contrary to the demands of the laws of nature, then you cannot rightfully claim that right under religious liberty. And I think part of the reason they did that was because many Americans at the time believed that God reveals His will, if you will, God reveals laws of morality in two ways. One is through Scripture, and the other is through the way nature is. And there's a great quote from James Wilson, for example, which I don't have with me, in which he says, "The laws of the sacred oracles of Scripture and the laws of nature flow divinely from the same authorical source. They just reveal themselves in a different way." So I think a lot of Americans try to say, look, okay, somebody's claiming to do this in the name of religious liberty. Is it acting contrary to the natural rights of others? Is it going to undermine the original purposes for which governments are established? If the answer to that is yes, then it's not an exercise of religious liberty. It may be an exercise of religious license or something like that. I don't know. I think that's well beyond what Jefferson thought. I don't think that's Jefferson's understanding of the relationship between religion and the law of nature. But Steve, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I didn't mean to.
Yeah, just on a much more mundane level regarding David's question of who decides. Hopefully this is helpful, but I'm not sure it will be. But we at least have to make the point that once the new Constitution is adopted, all of these questions, in a sense, are left at the state and local level, or certainly at the state level.
Right.
You know, the First Amendment and so forth. That is a restriction on the powers of the national government, not of the states. And of course, as I'm sure all of us know, there were these great disparities between levels of establishment within states. So Massachusetts had a state-supported Congregationalist establishment up until 1833, whereas states like Virginia, Jefferson and Madison's Virginia were, you know, much further ahead on the curve on that. So let's at least make sure we're all talking about the same thing here. The idea that the Supreme Court is going to decide what is a religious opinion and what is not, that doesn't come until the mid-20th century.
Right.
Just to get that out there.
Oh, that's a good point.
Great point, Steve. By the way, to the extent that the courts are going to handle any of these things, it's going to be done on the state level. And there's some great court cases on these questions. But how they're answered depends on the state you live in. So there was a court, I want to say, it's mainly the New England states that tend to lean in the direction of supporting more connection, right? More regulation by the state. But there's I think it may have been New York or I can't remember, New York or Massachusetts case. I want to say from the 1780s. I forget the name of the case, but I know there was somebody who was there was an atheist essentially. An atheist was publicly insulting Christianity and just religion in general, calling people, you know, anybody who believed in God an idiot. Particularly insulting the Catholic religion, I think, by calling. I don't even want to repeat what was said, but you know, really insulting stuff. And the intent was to clearly inflame people. And that went to court. He was arrested and made it to one of the state's higher courts. And that person was convicted, but not convicted for his religious opinions. He was convicted for disturbing the peace. Right? So there's an example of where you can't just go around violating the basic laws of society in the name of religious liberty. So they were careful if you were prosecuted or punished. It was not because of your religious liberty. The argument was this person was acting outside of what was protected by religious liberty.
Sure.
That undermines the basic purpose of God.
Again, just to show the differences and the distinctions between the Virginians, Madison and Jefferson. If you think of Massachusetts, at almost the same time that Madison is writing his remonstrance and Jefferson's writing the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, John Adams is up in Massachusetts drafting the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780, which basically makes it, and I've got a little bit of the language in front of me here, in order to promote the happiness and secure the good order and preservation of their government, the people of this Commonwealth have a right to invest their legislature with the power to authorize and require the towns, parishes, precincts, and other bodies politic to make suitable provision at their own expense for the institution of the public worship of God and for the support and maintenance of public Protestant teachers of piety, et cetera, et cetera. So we also need to be careful not to sort of present this as one sort of uniform position here. Prominent founders such as John Adams clearly believed in a kind of mixing of church and state.
Right.
By the way, there's another great court case. I think this was 1810. Barnes, the first parish of Falmouth in Massachusetts, having to do with this Constitution. Somebody had sued over those provisions because the legislature actually did enact a tax to support the teaching of Christian religion.
Yeah.
Teachers of Christianity in the state, and it made it to the state Supreme Court in Massachusetts. The Chief Justice of which was Theophilus Parsons. whose name should tell you everything you need to know about how he's going to decide the case. Right? The love of God. Okay? But he actually was one of the drafters with John Adams of the Constitution, Massachusetts Constitution, but he did not recuse himself from the case. Right. He provides a very eloquent defense of this establishment clause, and his prime argument is contrary to Madison and Jefferson. So he didn't mention it by name, but contrary to the views, the point that you all were raising earlier, that government support of religion is not necessary for the support of government, that religion is not necessary for government. Apples Parsons makes exactly the opposite argument. He says, without the aid of religion, government is highly defective because what religion provides, at the very least, is a belief in a kind of God who sees in the dark, this marvelous phrase from John Locke, because government can't be everywhere at the same time, preventing secret offenses and crimes hidden by darkness and these sorts of things. And his argument is religion benefits all, even if you don't believe in the religion that your money is going to support. You still benefit from it, his argument is, because that religion tends to make people better fathers, better wives, better husbands or parents, better citizens, and better neighbors. And that's a very different view, fundamentally opposed in many ways to the points you all were raising earlier from Jefferson and Madison.
Right.
So,
right.
Can we introduce another question from the participants? To just sort of extrapolate a little bit, or step back, get a larger picture view then from our discussion. One of our participants wants to know, in general, is the character of America, because of the nature of the founding and the things we've been talking about, is the character of America more religious than the rest of the world? And if so, is that a result of these sorts of things or not? I mean, I guess the question would be, what is the effect of the original understanding of religious liberty on American society as it developed afterwards?
Yeah.
It's a terrific question, and where I teach, we spend a lot of time not only teaching about American politics, but teaching about sort of comparative politics. And from what I understand in terms of polling data and so forth, the United States is still a remarkably religious nation in comparison to the rest of the world, certainly in comparison to many of our allies of Western Europe. And I think, polling data indicates that. I mean, maybe Americans to some extent are inflating their piety in answering these questions, but I think most social scientists would agree that this country is still remarkably religious, and Europeans, for instance, don't understand why we spend so much time arguing about issues like abortion or gay marriage or so forth. So there's a lot of evidence to indicate that, in fact, perhaps Madison and Jefferson were right in that organized religion in the United States seems to have flourished in comparison to the old world, where you had more of a tradition of mixing, and where arguably organized religion is, for all practical purposes, dead.
Yeah, I think, I agree with what you just said, Steve. I think that's right. And a certain amount of polling data looks at the issue from the obverse side. If you take those countries that are officially religious, like Saudi Arabia or Pakistan, and you ask people there to try to measure the same degree of piety or religiosity, externally they're very pious, of course, because if you're not, there are tremendous consequences for that, including just being killed. But I don't know how reliable these polls are, but I've heard that in private, there's a great deal, a much higher level of anti-religious feeling in those countries, and especially anti-clerical feeling there, and sort of just complete disregard of religious moderation or limits, in private life than you have in America. So, in other words, there's an external religiosity, but in private, it's very insincere, is what I've heard. Whereas in America, it's almost the opposite. Like the society as a whole seems, in some ways, very irreligious. You know, you have Miley Cyrus and stuff like that.
You're a big fan, aren't you, David?
But when you poll people about their religious opinions, you're right about those polls. Americans say things, you know, they believe in a God and in heaven. They tend not to believe in hell, but they believe in limits to what they should do, and they go to church much more regularly and so on, and they give a lot more to religious causes than other places in the world. And you know, I think that Madison and Jefferson would say, aha, yeah, that's what we expected to happen. We've removed the political issues from religion, and that allows religious sentiment in its pure form, unpolluted by political considerations, to flourish.
Yeah. It wasn't too long ago that we had an American president, I'm referring to George W. Bush, who, when asked in a presidential debate who his favorite political philosopher was, answered Jesus Christ.
Right, right.
Now, granted, that produced howls of derision in the usual circles, but it was also a message that was warmly received in many quarters of the country.
Right.
By the way, did Benjamin Franklin say almost the same thing? Probably in a different way. But, you know, Franklin imitate Jesus and Socrates and all things.
Yeah.
I don't know that President Bush meant exactly the same thing by it, but we can ask one more question from a participant, and then perhaps we can try to segue into related questions of American character and the larger understanding of liberty. But one last question on this topic: was religious liberty really a primary concern for the founders, or was it simply an effort to be quote unquote PC to gain support for the Constitution? How do you answer a question like that?
Well, go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, that's a hard question, because you sort of have to look into their hearts to answer that question. But I would say that it was a real concern to them, like a genuine, deep concern. But it's complicated, and it was one way to express it is that it was a real concern because they really did think that the mind was free, and that it really mattered to them that what you think is guided by reason and your own sense of what's true. And religion is a part of that. Religion is not the whole of that, but it's so connected to what, you know, the evidence that you as a rational, perceiving, thinking human being can attain. One of the things we mainly think about there is, you know, our religious questions, but it has to do with every part of the development of the human mind, and they were very concerned with that. And so you can't have free minds and free exchange of opinions unless you have religious freedom. And so I think partly for that reason they really did matter to them.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably the most important personal question an individual has to deal with. I believe that they believe that sincerely, right? That the questions of, as Madison says, the duty we owe to God, right?
Right.
These are the most probably important questions for everybody, whether you're an atheist or a believer, right? Everybody finds it. It's not, and that's why, you know, what was the advice Mom always gave? You know, you never talk about politics or religion in polite society, because people get upset about those things very easily, especially religion, right? And I think that's a great point, David. Steve, I didn't mean to cut you off if you were going to jump in.
No, I mean, it seems to me that the founders took religion very seriously. Again, whether each of them in their hearts, as David mentioned, was a believer or not, that's a hard question to pin down in many cases. But there's just all sorts, even in the Federalist Papers, Federalist number 10, Madison mentions religious factions as being a source throughout history of discord. So at the very least, the question of the role in religion in this new American experiment, I think, was very much in the forefront of their minds.
You know, let me just add that we haven't talked much about the Madison's little essay on property, or listing points on property, but there he says that conscience, which is very closely related to this question about religion, calls it the most sacred of all property. Kind of a striking phrase.
Yeah. I was struck by that piece. You know, I've read a lot of Jefferson and of Hamilton's writings, perhaps less so of Madison, but I have to say this was a remarkably, almost poetic, certainly very powerful piece, this essay on property. I was really struck by just the power of some of the lines.
So give us an example, Steve.
Well, a conscience is the most sacred of all property. A man's conscience is more sacred than his castle. Madison offers fair praise to a government where a man's religious rights are violated by penalties or lettered by tests or taxed by a hierarchy.
Yeah.
Man has not only a right to property, but a property in his rights. There's an almost Jeffersonian eloquence here that I wasn't sure Madison possessed. Just to throw that in.
Yeah. No, it's a really interesting, powerful little piece.
It really and by the way, also in that piece, he mentions not only can, of course, government attempt to oppress these most valued rights, but he notes that, quote, when there is an excess of liberty, the effect is the same, though coming from an opposite cause. In other words, I guess an acknowledgement that liberty can descend into what we would call license.
Right,
but
right.
That is very much a threat as well.
That's very much a threat. And so you have to, the trick in government is to have some kind of intermediate position between an excess of power and an excess of liberty.
Yeah.
How you strike that is the problem. Another interesting thing about this piece is how he, this reminded me a little bit of John Locke, in that, in the second treatise of government, Locke says that he's going to talk about life, liberty, and estate, all of which he calls by the general name property. Right. He like life and our liberties and our property, sort of more precisely understood. He's calling all that property, and Madison is kind of doing a similar thing here. Under the word property, including things like our opinions, our person, and our faculties, the development of our faculties.
And the objects upon which to apply our faculties, right? Our faculties.
And the objects upon which
we choose to apply those faculties to, yeah.
Right. So, yeah, he's trying to blend all that together somehow under the word property. So I think, that sort of that's a way of saying that at least in this piece, Madison really does take religious liberty very, very seriously.
Great point.
Or the rights of conscience.
Or the rights of conscience, yes. You're right. Yeah.
I don't know if either of you know the answer to this. I was trying to figure out what the context was for his delivering this essay. And of course, this would have been at the point where Jefferson and Madison, Jefferson was probably still in the Washington administration, but they had split from Washington and Hamilton. I don't know if you guys know the answer to this, but what prompted this this essay? Was there some concern about the taxing powers of the federal government, or what it was that prompted this?
I don't know, Steve.
Yeah.
Do you have an idea? I mean, Steve, to me, it's fascinating because for all the reasons that we've talked about, but also because it seems to be an attempt by Madison to establish what the standard should be for judging a just and wise government.
Yeah, yeah. Which leads me to believe it was in response to some action of the Washington administration, and who knows, maybe it was even, I don't know, I guess the Whiskey Rebellion was a little later, but sorry, anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Chris, this may go to the theme of character, the American character, but I think in this piece, Madison sort of indicates that there have been other governments that protected property in the narrow sense. You know, the British government, a man's home is sacred somehow, or a man's home is his castle. Every man's home is his castle, something like that. I'm not sure I have that right.
Yeah.
Madison says, yes, that's very important, but there's this other thing, a property and rights, that's also very important. You know, in the conclusion, he suggests that America will go beyond those places where a man's castle is sacred, and also make a man's rights protected. And that in some way, and he says that will be a pattern to all the world's governments.
Am I coming through okay? I was locked up for a while. I couldn't hear your conversation. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, I apologize. So if I repeat something that you said, I missed about 3 minutes of your conversation. I apologize. But to me, that the third to last paragraph is really really important in that it reveals, I think, some insight.
I think we're losing you again, Chris.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just going to read it. Madison says, a justice to property is not a just security to property is not. Can you hear me?
Yep.
We can sort of. It's sort of a little bit irregular.
Okay, sorry.
We can't. Chris, we can't. I can't hear you at least. Steve, can you hear him?
No, I cannot.
Okay. I wonder if we should. I have one other. While we're waiting for Chris to be able to come back on.
Sure.
You know that paragraph in this essay where he says that conscience is the most sacred of all property?
Yes.
I had to see if you can answer this question, Steve. He says, it's the most sacred of all property, other property depending in part on positive law, the exercise of that being a natural and unalienable right. To guard a man's house as his castle, to pay public and enforce private debts with the most exact faith, can give no title to invade a man's conscience, which is more sacred than his castle, or to withhold from it that debt of protection for which the public faith is pledged by the very nature and original conditions of the social pact. And like he's saying that this is another place where another piece of evidence that I would offer for Madison taking religion understood as conscience extremely seriously. It somehow, how is that the respect for conscience related to the very nature and original conditions of the social pact? Like he's sort of saying, you know, in the social contract theory, we form government by free and equal people coming together and agreeing on certain basic things, right? And that pact is, part of that pact is respect for conscience as the most sacred of all property. And he doesn't explain what that means. And do you have any thoughts on what that means?
Yeah.
You know?
No, not really, unfortunately. But again, it certainly reinforces what we were sort of getting at earlier. At least it seems to me that conscience is by far, the freedom of conscience is by far the primary foundation of the American experiment. And I think that the health, well-being, and status of religious institutions is far below that. I would if I could, because David, I'm not going to be able to give you a nice or any sort of succinct response to your previous question.
No, I go ahead.
Just the idea, what I found very powerful in this essay on property is this idea that material goods are not the decisive motivating factor in Madison and Jefferson's understanding of politics. And so often, at least in the 20th and 21st century, I think we tend to look at the founders and the founding through a sort of economic lens.
Right.
And certainly Charles Beard did this with his economic interpretation of the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that really is and it's very much a progressive interpretation of the founders and what the founding was about, which was this notion of a fairly exclusive group of people attempting to line their own pockets or protect their material interests. And it just seems to me that is so misguided, and it's been a kind of, it's taken us on a somewhat destructive detour, because it seems to me you could dismiss this as rhetoric, but I do believe a lot of these people put their lives, their fortunes, their sacred honor on the line for something far more important, far more durable than material well-being. And that's why when I started off by saying I found this to be a very almost poetic piece that I hadn't quite seen with Madison before, but certainly see it in Jefferson.
Yeah.
I hope that makes some sense.
That makes a lot of sense to me, and I think you're right about that. And you know, in addition, the property in the usual sense, you know,
Yeah.
ownership of the external things in the world, that's an important thing. But
sure,
the use of our faculties, the free use of our faculties, and you know, the free development and communication of our opinions, those two things are equally important. And actually, I think what that passage about conscience suggests, that they're actually more important than than property in the narrow sense.
Yes, absolutely. Chris, are you back with us? Okay.
Yes. Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah. I'm great statements, great ideas that you're throwing out there. If you lose me again, please continue to proceed without me. But yeah, I agree totally, David. I think for Madison, what comes through here is that it's not the property in the ordinary sense that.
Oh man, Chris, I'm just
that is the result of the free use of one's mind and faculties. That matters is. Can you hear me now? No,
Chris, I'm just not getting you clearly.
Right. Okay. I think we have a problem with our signal here where I'm at. So
we're getting you now. I'm getting you now. Try it again, Chris.
My sense is that for Madison, what matters most is not the property that is a result of the free use of our faculties, it's the free use of our faculties itself.
Mm-hmm.
Because that again, because as you've been pointing out, that's my free, and that includes free to come up with its own opinion, free, including religious opinion, and free to choose the objects upon which to use our faculties and talents that we have by nature. Then you have no liberty. And I can't help but try to connect
Chris, Steve, I don't know if you can hear Chris, but there are long periods when I can't hear.
Yeah, I couldn't catch it all.
Yeah, I think he might have been wanting to head off to Federalist 10. Madison says something very interesting, developing this same opinion. He says there in a very famous passage that the diversity in the faculties of men from which the rights of property originate is not, and the protection of these faculties is the first object of government. protection of the faculties from which property arises, but property of all different kinds. But then even if you say, well, the faculties that he's referring to in the Peace on Property from 1792, those faculties relate to property in the more normal sense. It's still the development of the human faculties that's the issue. And there's still also the opinions and the free expression of those opinions that are things above and beyond property, however you understand that sort of in the normal sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's a great point, Steve. At least for these people, they really thought that our opinions, and especially as Madison says here, our opinions in general, but especially our religious opinions and the practices that our religious opinions point to, those are crucial things.
David, I wanted to ask you, one of our readings for today was Madison's speech on the various amendments to the Constitution, which he delivers when the new Congress convenes in the summer of 1789. And as you know, Madison at first was opposed to the idea of including a Bill of Rights in the Constitution. And part of the reason he objected to this, to adding a Bill of Rights, was that there would be a difficulty in terms of enumerating all the rights that deserve protection.
Right.
That legislatures were capable of, and I think he uses the term infinitude of legislative expedients.
Right.
So how do you create a list of perfect and complete specification of all protected rights? Once you do that, perhaps you are no longer saying that these rights are natural rights, but these are in fact rights granted by the government to the people, and implying perhaps that they could be taken away at some point. And I'm wondering, in terms of the topic of religion and establishment and so forth, I'm wondering if the established state churches would have eventually died of their own accord, which in a sense they did, since the Federal Bill of Rights did not apply to the states until the Civil War Amendment. And did we perhaps create, did the Bill of Rights create just a kind of can of worms in terms of, if you think of all the Supreme Court jurisprudence on freedom of religion and the Establishment Clause and so forth, it's just been an endless attempt to try to draw lines around whether, giving parochial school parents reimbursements for textbooks or for bus transportation expenses or whatever.
Right.
Every year the Supreme Court has to wrestle with these kinds of decisions. Would it in fact have been better perhaps not to have included a Bill of Rights, and in particular that First Amendment, which has generated so many legal cases of kind of a conflicting result?
Yeah. So that's your question?
Well, I don't know. It was a speech / question, but
no, that's a difficult question. I'm not sure what I think about that. That was partly originally Madison's concern, right? Like the two sort of concerns. The other one was that if you make a list of rights, people will come to think of those as the only rights.
Correct.
And, and so that was a problem, and that problem I think certainly hasn't come true. We create rights all the time. Everything we want almost becomes a right now.
Right.
And I think the real difficulty is that we somehow lost a true sense of what's a natural right as opposed to what's a legal right.
Great point.
Yeah. So, but yeah, is the question? Is the question that we would have been better off in the sense that our disputes would not have all become these sort of legal national disputes?
Correct.
Which in a way really divides us. Yeah.
Yeah.
If we didn't have the Bill of Rights, that we would have fought out these questions probably, but in some different way.
Through the political process, through the elected process. Yeah.
Or would they still be made in the state law? I mean, without a Bill of Rights, would you have had a 14th Amendment? Right? I mean, as you said earlier, the original intention was to allow the people of each state to decide for themselves these rights.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
But there's the tendency in the late 1800s, early 1900s, was to sort of nationalize everything. That is, provide one sort of national standard for everything.
Yes.
That grew among those who thought, well, the 14th Amendment should therefore be used to bring under sort of, I don't want to call it national control, but to provide a kind of national uniformity for how we as a nation think about rights. And that really, I think, opened the door for the courts in the early 20th century to use the 14th Amendment as the excuse to settle all of these questions.
Yes. I know that Gordon Wood noted once that the Bill of Rights had little impact for the first 150 years of the country's history. So
it really did.
Yeah.
Steve, you know, the courts were constantly turning down attempts.
Yeah.
The people were trying to get the federal courts to take up some of these issues, but as John Marshall pointed out in Barron v. Baltimore, right? Was that 1830, 33, something like that?
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, you know, the Constitution does not give us the authority to deal with these things. You don't like the state, the law of the state, you change it, you leave. But we have since moved away from the idea that we are a federal sort of conglomerate, union in that sense, and now we've come to the opinion that the Supreme Court does have the final say on all these questions, and they have the say for the whole nation. Again, the 14th Amendment is such a tricky amendment. It's hard to say.
Hello? David, are you still there?
Yes, I am. Is that you, Steve?
Yes.
I'm not sure who else is here.
Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just saying that the 14th Amendment, it's so hard to tell what the intent of the 14th Amendment was in its entirety. We know one purpose of the 14th Amendment was to protect former slaves and the enjoyment of basic rights guaranteed by the Bill of Rights in the aftermath of the Civil War. But it just seems to me that in the 20th century, the tendency has been for the courts to say the 14th Amendment has authorized us to have the final say on a national basis what rights are out there. And the American people have tended to, I don't want to oversimplify it, but have tended to sort of acquiesce in that view of the courts. With regard to the First Amendment, as you know, it wasn't really until the 1930s, I believe, right, that the Supreme Court was willing to get involved in the statute.
Yeah, I think the first case was Gitlow versus New York, which is 1925, but yeah.
Speech case, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Then with the establishment case, it was
Everson.
Everson v. Board, right?
1947.
And since then, the significance of that case is that was the Supreme Court asserting our its authority to decide these questions of establishments.
That's right. And that's the famous case where Justice Black cites Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptists about a wall of separation between church and state, which arguably it's kind of interesting to think that this letter in some ways has replaced the actual language of the Constitution as the dominant legal holding for these questions of church and state. It's kind of remarkable that that's the case. But I think if you were to ask most Americans, is the phrase wall of separation included in the Bill of Rights, they would probably say yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very interesting. And the other irony is in that letter to the Danbury Baptist Association, Jefferson's praising that act of the whole American people, in prohibiting their legislature from having any say on these religious questions. And in that letter itself, Jefferson is saying he's strictly praising the Bill of Rights from prohibiting the national government from getting involved in religious questions. Now we know Jefferson, of course, on the state level, believed that government should do that as well. But you know, Jefferson, despite his belief that the government should keep its hands out of religion entirely, also supported the idea of federalism.
Yeah.
And my sense is Jefferson would say, look, you know, in Virginia we got it right. If those idiots up in Massachusetts want to have an establishment, you know, they're wrong. It's a violation of national rights, blah blah blah. But you know, what are you going to do?
Right.
Their freedom to run the state. That's the essence of federalism. So the irony is, Justice Everson is using that kind of letter to now say the states should no longer be free.
Yeah.
Justice
on their own. But
Justice Black, who he's the first justice to sort of, well, not the first, but when the Supreme Court in the Everson case invokes the language about a wall of separation, Black, of course, was a major admirer of Thomas Jefferson, and again, I just sort of raised it's just remarkable to me that this letter has kind of emerged as the seminal document on these questions as opposed to the actual language in the Constitution or even in the ratification debates over the First Amendment.
Yeah.
There's another great letter. I know you're familiar with it from.
No. Go ahead, Chris.
I didn't mean to interrupt your thought. I just wanted to point out, I know you're familiar with this. There's another letter from Jefferson to the Reverend Samuel Miller.
Mm-hmm.
It's around 1808, or the end of his presidency. And I think this is Samuel Miller. Tell me if I'm cutting in and out again, please. But he has asked Jefferson, why not imitate President Washington and issue a proclamation of Thanksgiving? And Jefferson says, I know Washington did it, but I'm not going to do it just because Washington did it. He says, you know, my thought is if I issue a proclamation of Thanksgiving, I would be influencing people who would feel as though they had to comply and give thanks, but because of essentially peer pressure or, you know, societal pressure to you know, to sort of conform here to these views. They might feel as though they're being punished if they didn't give thanks. At the end of this letter, he says, or no, sorry, it's toward the beginning actually. He says, my view of these things is informed by the 10th Amendment, right, which says, you know, that the national government and the 10th Amendment in conjunction with the First Amendment says that Congress shall have no ability, cannot pass a law doing these things. And the national government, he says, is interdicted from having any kind of say whatsoever with regard to religion. And he says the 10th Amendment tells me that since the national government has no authority to do so, that power, insofar as it can rest with anybody, must have been left to the state. So even in that letter, I'm paraphrasing the whole thing, Jefferson almost implies, begrudgingly, right, that yeah, the Constitution, it does leave it to the state to decide for themselves. If a state government wants to issue a proclamation for Thanksgiving, or you know, have a day of Thanksgiving, then you know, again, the Constitution leaves it to the state to do so. I, Jefferson, don't necessarily believe that's the right thing, but here's Jefferson, you know, who has his convictions with regard to separation of church and state, but also is somebody who supports federalism.
Yeah.
So. Now, Madison, as I mentioned earlier, Madison wanted an amendment in the Constitution that would have prohibited states from getting that, but Congress didn't vote for it.
Great point. Great point. Yep.
So, you know, it is what it is. and there's really much you can do. Yeah. So the other alternative is, Jefferson and Madison believe that their view of right doing things at the time would leave it to the American people as a whole to come to see that the Virginia view of things is better than the Massachusetts view of things. And over time, that's kind of what happened. As you pointed out, Steve, the the states who have establishment clauses, pretty much, I think, by the 1830s, right? The
1833 for Massachusetts. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
which was the last. It's funny. I was just looking up to see if James Madison, while he was president, ever issued any Thanksgiving proclamations, and he did. At least I was able to find two near the end of his second term, 1814 and 1815. But he makes it clear in both of those Thanksgiving proclamations that he's essentially following the directive of the House and the Senate, who asked him to issue such a proclamation. I don't think he would have done it without it. And he also makes note of the fact that the nation's at war, so I'm sure he thought this was a good thing to do in the midst of the War of 1812.
Right.
Which makes sense.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Dave.
You were going to comment on the fact that the Madison's proclamations came during wartime, because that's a very interesting thing that in a way distinguishes America from, especially at this time, from other countries. That I think the founders didn't anticipate that the United States would be at war very often.
That's right.
So and it's somehow, religious sentiments do tend to come to the fore during wartime when more ultimate questions are right immediately in front of you.
Mm-hmm.
So,
David, can you hear me?
You've been really going in and out still over the last 5 minutes, I would say. I can hear you sometimes, but then there will be a section of maybe 20 seconds when I can't hear you.
Okay. I just quickly was going to point out, case in point, Abraham Lincoln, who was not known for his, attachment to any particular religious sect.
Yeah.
But he also issued proclamations.
He did. Yeah.
During time of war. So I'll mute myself since I'm breaking up.
Yeah. I think we've lost you again, Chris.
Lost you.
Yeah.
Steve, did you feel like we discussed that issue? Are there?
I guess.
David, did you mean the issue of the Bill of Rights or
right? Yeah.
First Amendment? Yeah, I think we. I mean, as I understand it, Madison sends a copy of the proposed Constitution to Jefferson in Paris. Jefferson writes back and says he likes what he sees, but he had a few problems with it, one of which was the absence of a Bill of Rights. I don't think he uses that phrase, Bill of Rights, but some guaranteed protections. And John Adams, I believe, feels the same way. He's also I believe he's in Paris. He might be in London at this time. Maybe he's in London. He and Jefferson are actually writing back and forth, and they share this view that there needs to be some explicit guarantee of various rights.
Right.
And then, of course, Madison comes around, but only after states like Massachusetts and some of the others sort of qualify their ratification on the grounds that some effort will be made once the new government convenes to draw up a list of these rights and to send them out to the states for ratification as amendments to the Constitution.
Yeah.
So, but again, it's I suppose it's less a question of whether there should have been a Bill of Rights. As Chris rightly pointed out, it was, of course, the Civil War amendments, the 14th Amendment, that is ultimately interpreted in such a way that all of these provisions in the Bill of Rights are selectively applied to the states.
Right.
But
you could, I think that's right. I don't really have anything more to add to that question or conversation.
Sure.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
I mean, I'm sorry, David, unless you want to go.
I had another question that I would put on the table.
Please, go ahead.
Okay. It has to do with the American character. In the Federalist Papers, Hamilton, I think, says at some point that he refers to the enterprising character of the American seaman, especially, but that enterprising character, and he calls it something like an inexhaustible mine of national wealth. And when Tocqueville visited America, he was sort of astonished and in some ways appalled at how Americans were, what Hamilton called the enterprising character, Tocqueville saw as just kind of this sort of general restlessness, moving around all the time, building a house on the prairie and then moving before the trees are even starting to grow and stuff like that.
That's because Tocqueville was a disciple of himself. Just throwing that out there.
Say that again?
Tocqueville was a disciple of Rousseau. I'm just throwing that out. He was a
disciple of Rousseau, yeah. No, so my point is, but there is something to this. There's a kind of enterprisingness or restlessness, ambition, in a way a worldly ambition to get things done, to build things, to move west, that somehow or other characterizes America, right? Like we're not passive people who just sort of let things wash over us.
We're not.
And my question is, does that enterprising character, how is that related to religious liberty? And I'll just throw out this idea that, when you have in a place where the government, using its incredible resources and powers of taxation and compulsion, is telling you what to think, that becomes the thing you have to concentrate on, either reacting to it or accepting it and promoting it. But when the government says, okay, we're not going to tell you the answers to the ultimate questions, your mind can figure that out for yourself. Is it possible that sort of lets people's passions and sort of a natural restlessness just kind of become much more prominent than it would in many other countries or political systems? So I guess I'm trying to draw a connection between the religious liberty that existed and does exist in the United States and that enterprising character of Americans, if you want to accept that there is that enterprising character.
I certainly accept it. I think, as you mentioned, Tocqueville certainly accepted it, and it seems to me he was a pretty perceptive analyst of the American way of life. I think he also has quite a few chapters in there where he talks about the lack of a kind of philosophical depth to the American people, and I think also he may describe American religious beliefs as somewhat, certainly unexamined, I guess would be the best.
Right. Yeah.
So
we have I think that's probably right. That maybe would go along with this. That we're not compelled to face religious questions. We can if we want to.
Yeah.
No one's helping us. You don't have very smart, priests and leaders telling us what to think and making us learn catechisms and so forth. And that maybe leads to a certain shallowness.
Yeah. I think he certainly believed that. That's about as far as I can take that, David. But the notion that the American people are enterprising, I'd be, boy, if somebody can come up with something that counters that, I'd be shocked. Yeah. I do wonder if by separating church and state and by, in a sense, unleashing this incredible entrepreneurial spirit, if both of those did contribute to what some more conservative Christians and even Jews in the United States would today describe as sort of the naked public square. In other words, we've gone so far in terms of scrubbing the public square, the public sector of any references to religion that the governmental policies, the laws of the land, and so forth are no longer neutral. They are, in fact, adversarial, and that is somehow destructive to the character of the citizenry.
Yeah. To the extent that laws are adversarial to religion, that would seem to run counter to what either Jefferson or Madison wanted.
Yeah.
It should be neutral. It should neither favor nor disfavor.
Right.
If that's possible.
Of course, you have a major battle underway between the Catholic Church and some evangelical.
I think this goes back to the.
Sorry, Chris.
No, go ahead, please.
You have a major battle going on today between the Catholic Church and some evangelical organizations about provisions in Obamacare that require coverage for abortions and contraception and so forth. And I'm not sure that kind of government intervention would have been tolerated, certainly by the founders, but even as recently as perhaps, the early 20th century or whatever. Perhaps I'm wrong, but it does raise this question of whether we really have moved into this era of the naked public square where religious considerations, it's something you do behind closed doors. It's something that has to be private. It can't be allowed to taint the public square.
Yeah, in any way.
In any way. Yeah.
It does.
If I can jump in, I don't know.
Yeah.
Can you hear me? I was just going to point out quickly that I think one of the things that we get from our conversation today, at least, is that I think in the minds of most Americans at the time of the founding, there's this idea of no establishment of religion and the right to free exercise are compatible ideas, which is why I think they both end up in the First Amendment, right? There are actually two different religious clauses in the First Amendment, right? Congress shall not create an establishment of religion or pass a law respecting an establishment or infringe the free exercise of religion. I think what has happened in the 20th century as a result of the 14th Amendment and the court's involvement, the courts see those two things as fundamentally opposed. My impression is that the court throughout the 20th century have placed much more emphasis on upholding the idea of separating church and state to the detriment of the free exercise of religion. Yeah. They're more concerned with keeping state and church separate, that is, keeping religion out of the public sphere, than they are with the belief of all founders, including Jefferson and Madison, that to infringe on your religious beliefs and the free expression of those religious beliefs, as Madison says, is actually the worst kind of violation of a natural law. And I think the courts have sacrificed that for the idea that it's more important to keep religion out of the public sphere. Yeah. I hope I didn't break up.
No, we got you.
Yeah, we got you. We got you that time.
While we're talking about this, let me point out that we're sort of coming to the close of our time. So I encourage participants, if they have other questions, to start getting them in now, and we'll try to make good use of our last few minutes together answering those things. So let me back up, if you don't mind, and just sort of ask a bigger question then to both of our panelists. To what extent do you think this very broad understanding of American liberty, including religious liberty, has had really in the long run on the idea of the kind of American character that has or has not changed, should change, should not. To what extent is the American character defined by their idea of liberty, their concept of liberty, including religious liberty? Any thoughts on that? Is there such a thing as American character? I mean, some people question that even.
Oh, I believe there is. I mean, I still think this is a nation of very independent people who question authority, who are fiercely resistant to a hierarchy, in a sense. The emphasis on individual rights that one sees in the United States is far more pronounced. All you have to do is cross the border and go into Canada. No offense to any of my Canadian friends. Mr. Foster. But I think there's far more of a communitarian ethos in Canada than one sees in the United States, for better or for worse.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I agree with that. You know, there's this very simple thing that maybe when you see an American in some other country, there's something that you know almost instantly that's an American. Yeah, I think so. There's a kind of I think you still have something of that, maybe a bit attenuated now, of that enterprising spirit, of a concern for developing your own opinions, and I think you still have some of that feistiness, you know, to defend rights, including the rights of liberty. You know, Madison says that he says it is proper to take alarm at the first experiment on our liberties, even if it seems like a small thing. And I think I still see that, you know, quite strong in America, that people defend their liberties even when you think that it's a relatively small thing that's being threatened.
Yeah. By the way, Americans had a slogan at the time of the American founding. You know, you've seen the slogans like "Don't tread on me" and, you know, "Join or die." They also had "Obsta Principiis," which in Latin means "oppose the beginnings," right? So they would actually go around saying "Obsta Principiis." As soon as you smell or sniff a violation of liberty, you have to crush it.
Right.
Yeah, that's still very much true. There's a great, you know, Edmund Burke's speech on reconciliation has a portion where he tries to explain to his fellow MPs why these Americans love liberty so much. And Burke says, you know, they smell tyranny around every corner. That's true, I mean, right?
Yes.
So we smell just the very slightest appearance of tyranny.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, my impression is that sense is somewhat diminished if you compare today to the founding era.
Yes.
But I think it's still there, strongly. But it needs to be revived, somehow kept alive, I guess.
If I could put my 2 cents on that, I would suggest that the turning point in that, I agree completely, David, around the time of Franklin Roosevelt, the emphasis in this country shifted from that older understanding of liberty to an emphasis on security. And I don't mean foreign policy security, I mean economic security. And, you know, read some of Franklin Roosevelt's speeches, for example, when he introduces the idea of a second Bill of Rights, an economic Bill of Rights. And you look at his speeches in 32, 34, and 36, especially 36 when he's running for re-election. The theme of most of his speeches is security.
Security, right.
Yeah, and I think it's Franklin. I don't want to single him out. He's not the only one, but you really see in his rhetoric anyway the idea that democracy is more about security than it is about that kind of liberty, that individual liberty that comes from being free to form your own opinions and decide on your own actions, as Madison describes it in his piece on property, right? Freely choosing the objects upon which you're going to exercise your faculty.
Right.
That's my broad take.
Chris and Steve, do either of you know whether the idea of religious liberty, roughly the idea that we've been talking about today, has ever been critiqued by an important American? Like today it seems like, I think you're right, Chris, that there's a greater emphasis on security now than there was at the founding. Yeah. But there's still an across-the-board sense that religious liberty is important. Both the left and the right agree today.
You know, I'm not sure, David. I can't point to a particular name for you, but I know in the last couple of years with this debate over the so-called Obamacare and whether Catholic institutions, hospitals, universities, and some evangelical institutions should be forced to provide this kind of coverage for abortion and contraception and so forth. There are,
Right.
I would say there's an emerging force on the left that is now really starting to question the place of religious liberty in American life and seeing it as a somewhat destructive force in terms of resisting progressive change.
Right.
And I can't throw a name out to you, but
that would be very interesting. There, you know, if someone in that accepting that perspective would directly attack the idea of religious liberty.
Yeah.
I can, for example, you mentioned I can think of a few progressives who, interestingly enough, around the turn of the century, called for government regulation of religion, total government regulation of religion, explicitly.
Wow.
Precisely because they saw in that original notion of religious liberty the very essence of individualism.
Right.
Right, because traditional, as Madison says, right, your right to conscience is important because it is the most fundamental question one can ask about one's own being or existence.
Right.
And progressives recognize that kind of understanding of religion and religious liberty emphasized the extent to which one was an individual and not a part of society. It actually emphasized the extent to which one was free to decide for oneself, rather than simply submitting to the demands of the welfare of society as a whole. So there were some pretty hardcore progressives, John Dewey among them, who himself was an atheist, but John Dewey was calling for the regulation of religion so that the government could give people the right kinds of religious opinions that would get them more oriented toward thinking of the welfare of society as a whole and less about the salvation of their own soul. So there are some earlier critiques of that understanding of religion.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting, Chris. And I think an issue that we are now facing and grappling with that's related to this, of course, is the issue of how to deal with Islam and Muslim Americans. You know, how do we apply these founding ideas that really were developed in the context of Christianity to a new kind of problem, and a religion that very clearly identifies religious opinions with law.
Right.
You know, that includes political law. So I think that's to me, when I look at the debate we have over that, there's a kind of confusion about it. We don't really know how to grapple with that issue.
Yeah, another great point. In those speeches I mentioned earlier, the sermons and speeches from the founding, I actually came across references to Muslims. They called them Mohammedans back then, which is not necessarily the politically correct term today, but there were several references to them, and from the sermons that I read or speeches that I wrote, the general consensus seemed to be, look, as long as they believe in natural rights, let them believe what they want. There was suspicion among, I think, New England states, especially of Catholics and Muslims in particular, because they didn't think that those religions would allow for people to see the truth of natural rights on the natural laws.
Right.
But there are some writings from the time that say as long as they agree to respect the rights of others, yeah, why not? But yeah, you're right, David. It is a difficulty we're facing today. Just two last questions. I think we can end with these. They're both related, so I'll ask them both. One is, when have we started to see such an adversarial relationship between Americans on religious questions? When did this begin? When did religion become so adversarial between Americans? And a related question is, do you foresee a decline in American interest in religion or the rights of conscience?
When did it become adversarial in terms of religion being a force in American? Yeah. Well, we sort of pounded this home, but it seems to me it's when we kind of nationalized it in a sense. It took a while, but once the First Amendment, working through the 14th Amendment, became an issue for the federal courts, I think that's when things became adversarial. And of course, you had a whole series of decisions: contraception, abortion in 1973, now gay marriage. I think that that just stokes the flames on both sides between believers and non-believers. So to me, it seems to have been pretty much a mid-20th century phenomenon up until the present. However, having said that, it's important to note that almost every major social domestic reform movement, whether it was the abolition of slavery, women's suffrage, prohibition, the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s was led by black Protestant ministers, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, opposition to the Vietnam War, and so forth. I mean, American history has been shaped by these movements that were rooted in the pulpits of America.
Right.
Even the American Revolution itself, arguably, I think Chris or somebody referred earlier to a lot of these revolutionary era sermons.
Yeah.
So religion still plays this incredibly important role in American society, but I think these contentious battles, overstating it a bit, but I think it becomes very much a part of our lives when the Supreme Court and, in a sense, the federal government nationalizes these questions.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. No, that's great, Steve. Surprisingly, maybe I agree with everything you said just now.
You're a good man. What was the decline question? I'm sorry, there was a second question about decline or something.
Do you foresee a decline? Do you foresee a decline in? Let's see if I can find it. I'm not sure where I put the question, but do you foresee a decline in American interest, or I suppose a defense of religious liberty or the right to conscience? You see that declining?
Again, in my opinion, I do, and I think if you were to follow the current debate closely over this question, I don't hate to keep coming back to it, but this question of whether Obamacare and the idea of forcing religious institutions that are opposed to abortion, opposed to contraception. There's either an attitude on the part of some supporters of Obamacare that this is just an illegitimate objection for these kind of folks to raise, and in that sense, I think there would have been far more outrage about a government edict such as that as recently as 50 or 60 years ago.
Yeah.
To some extent, I'm surprised at how muted the reaction has been.
Yeah.
I don't want to make this a partisan thing. I'm not trying to, but I do think things have changed to some extent.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. And your point earlier, Chris, about how we've shifted more to what was the word? Safety or security, and that combined with a certain turn away from being oriented by the individual rights, the individual mind, individual freedoms, and more sort of thinking of people in terms of group identities. I think that if you move in that direction, you will move away from religious liberty as understood by the founders, for whom it really was rooted in the individual conscience and individual reason.
Great. Well, fantastic. Let me say thanks to both of you for being with us today. Our time is up. I hope I'm coming through clearly. I do apologize for the technical problems on my end. We'll try to get this resolved for next time. But thanks very much, David and Steve, for being with us. It was absolutely fantastic, very enlightening, and I'm very grateful for your time, and look forward to talking to both of you soon again.
Well, thanks for the opportunity, Chris.
Great. Thank you. Thanks again to our panelists, and thanks to all the participants for some great questions. They were fantastic. Just a quick word at the end of this. If you're participating in this, you will be asked to fill out a survey form. Please complete that form and include your address so that we can send you a letter documenting your participation today. If you've enjoyed today's webinar, please consider taking an online graduate course through the Ashland Center, offered as part of our Master of Arts in American and History Government program, Master of Arts in History and Government program, which you can find out more about at Ashbrook's website, teachingamericanhistory.org. One other thing to mention is for those of you who were here for the first webinar and wanted to view it again, we are working on a sort of technical problem to get that posted. Hopefully we'll be able to resolve that and get the first webinar video and audio up. At some point, like I said, we ran into a technical problem sort of beyond our control, trying to get that posted, and we're trying to get that resolved. So hopefully we'll be able to do that soon. Thanks again, everybody, and have a great rest of the weekend.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks again.
Thank you, Steve.
Oh, thanks, David.
And gentlemen.